She walked into a room full of killers wearing a red dress, and every single one of them went quiet. Not because she was beautiful, not because she was bold, because she knew every dirty secret buried in their bank accounts. In one night, Naomi Brooks would either save an empire or become the reason it burned to the ground. This is a story about power, loyalty, and one woman who refused to be invisible in a world that had been trying to erase her since the day she was born. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Chicago in late November had a particular cruelty to it. Not the dramatic movie poster kind of cold where snow drifts picture perfect against glowing streetlights. This was a mean cold, the kind that crawled up through the concrete, through the soles of your shoes, and settled somewhere in your chest like a warning you couldn't quite translate. The wind off Lake Michigan had teeth, and it bit without apology, and the people who had grown up in this city had learned long ago not to expect any. Naomi Brooks had grown up in this city. She knew what cold felt like. She'd known it since she was 9 years old, standing on the stoop of her grandmother's house on the south side in a coat 2 sizes too small, watching the other kids on the block with their puffy North Face jackets and their certainty that someone in the world was paying attention to keeping them warm. Nobody had been paying attention to Naomi back then. She had learned to pay attention to herself. 22 years later, she sat at a desk on the 43rd floor of the Viscari Tower, and the view through the floor-to-ceiling windows was the whole of Chicago spread out below her like something she had personally conquered. Maybe that was arrogance. Maybe that was just the truth. It was hard to tell the difference some mornings. The desk was organized the way her mind was organized, obsessively, with categories that made sense only to her. 3 monitors, all active. A legal pad on the left, covered in her handwriting, columns of numbers with arrows connecting them like a map of something dangerous. A coffee mug, black, no sugar, always, sitting on a ceramic coaster that her grandmother had given her when she got the job, the one with the chipped edge that she had never replaced because she wasn't the kind of woman who threw away things that still worked, and a phone that hadn't stopped buzzing for the last 40 minutes. She let it buzz. She was looking at a number that didn't belong. $4,318,000 moved through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, routed through a legitimate-looking real estate holding in Luxembourg, and quietly deposited into an account that, on paper, belonged to a catering company in suburban Milwaukee. The catering company had 11 employees, a modest website with stock photos of past appetizers, and a revenue history that couldn't possibly justify the transfer without raising 17 different flags. It was beautiful work. Whoever had built it had talent, but they hadn't been as careful as Naomi. She followed the thread backward, the way she always did, not forward toward the money's destination, but backward toward its origin, because that was always where the real story lived. People who moved dirty money thought about the destination. Naomi thought about the source. It was a difference in perspective that had saved Dominic Viscari's organization from federal prosecution no fewer than 4 times in the 6 years she had worked for him. She pulled up a second window, cross-referenced 2 transaction dates, and felt something tighten in her stomach. The origin was close, not outside the organization, not a rival moving against them from a distance. The origin of this particular piece of missing money was someone inside the building, someone who had access to accounts that required a level of clearance that only 7 people in the entire Viscari operation possessed. Naomi leaned back in her chair. She was not a woman who panicked. Panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Instead, she let the information settle into her body the way cold settled into the city, quietly, completely, without drama. She felt it in her shoulders first. Then, in the slow, deliberate breath she pulled in through her nose and pushed out through her mouth, she reached for her phone, not to answer it, to dial. It rang twice before he picked up. "You're supposed to be reviewing the Harmon portfolio." Dominic Viscari's voice was exactly what you'd expect from a man who had never once in his adult life been spoken over. Low, precise, with a quality that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite coldness, but occupied some controlled middle territory that made most people deeply uncomfortable. Naomi had long since stopped being most people. "Someone inside your organization is stealing from you," she said. No greeting, no preamble. In 6 years, she had learned that preamble was how you wasted the time of people who already knew you were competent. 4.3 million. It's been moving for 11 weeks. pause. 3 seconds, maybe 4. For Dominic Viscari, that was the equivalent of anyone else dropping their coffee. "Where are you?" "My office." "Stay there." The line went dead. She put the phone down and looked back at the screen. 43 floors below, Chicago went about its business. Cabs cutting through intersections, pedestrians bent against the November wind, delivery trucks double-parked on Michigan Avenue while the city flowed irritably around them. None of them knew what was happening above them. None of them needed to. That was another thing Naomi had understood since childhood. The world was full of machinery that most people never saw, grinding away above and below the surface of ordinary life. And the people who ran that machinery had no particular interest in being seen. She was part of that machinery. She had chosen to be, with her eyes open, which was more than she could say for most of the people who served Dominic Viscari, without fully understanding what they were serving. She understood exactly what she was serving. She just happened to be very, very good at it. The elevator doors opened 7 minutes later. Dominic walked like a man who had never in his life been genuinely surprised by anything, which was mostly true and entirely cultivated. He was 44 years old, with a face that had never been conventionally handsome but had always been arresting. Dark eyes that processed information at a speed that most people found unsettling, a jaw that looked like it had been built for a specific purpose, and a quality of stillness that his enemies consistently and fatally misread as passivity. He was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he moved through her office the way he moved through every space, as if it had been built specifically for him, and he was simply confirming that fact. He did not sit down. "Show me." Naomi turned one of her monitors toward him and pulled up the transaction thread she had mapped. She walked him through it in less than 4 minutes, because she had learned that Dominic absorbed information fastest when it was delivered without commentary, without caveats, and without the kind of dramatic framing that lesser analysts use to make themselves seem essential. The numbers told the story. She let the numbers do it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You said 7 people have clearance at this level." "Yes." "And you've narrowed it to 1? "I've narrowed it to 2. I need another 6 hours to confirm which one." He looked at the screen for another moment. Then he looked at her. There was something in his expression that he almost immediately put away. Not quickly enough for her to miss it, but quickly enough for her to file it under the category of things she had decided years ago not to examine too closely. 6 hours, he repeated. "I'll know before midnight. There's the gala tonight." She had not forgotten about the gala. She had been trying not to think about it, which was unusual for her, because Naomi Brooks did not generally try not to think about things. Thinking was her primary tool, but the gala had a specific complication attached to it that she hadn't quite resolved, and she didn't like operating with unresolved complications. "I'll be there," she said. "I'll have the information before I leave." He nodded once. He moved toward the door. "Naomi." She looked up. He didn't say anything else for a moment, just stood there in the doorway with the hallway light behind him, and something flickered across his face that she couldn't name and he apparently couldn't say. "Good work," he said finally. The door closed. She turned back to the monitors and started pulling the next thread. The problem with the gala, or one of several problems, because the evening was already assembling itself into a collection of problems, declared itself at 4:47 in the afternoon when her assistant, Marcus, opened her office door wearing an expression that Naomi had come to recognize as his disaster face. Marcus was 26, efficient, and had the specific quality of a person who had been disappointed by the world enough times to have developed a very precise relationship with bad news. He didn't soften it. He didn't inflate it. He delivered it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, with the information first and the emotional scaffolding second. "Your dress," he said. She looked up from the screen. "What about my dress?" "The dry cleaner." A pause. "There was an incident with a steam press. Your Navy Armani is..." He made a shape with his hands that conveyed destruction without requiring a specific vocabulary for it. "It's gone." Naomi was still for exactly 3 seconds. "The gala starts at 7. "I know." "It is now 4:47. "I know." She breathed in slowly through her nose. The navy suit had been chosen deliberately. It was professional. It was authoritative. It covered what she wanted covered and presented what she wanted presented. It said, "I am a financial strategist. I am here to work. I am not here to be looked at." After years of walking into rooms where the looking started before the thinking, Naomi had become deeply particular about controlling the visual message she sent before she opened her mouth. "What are my options?" she said. Marcus held up one finger, which meant one option, which meant he had already explored every other avenue and found it closed. Meredith in Legal had a gown she bought for a charity event last spring and never wore. She offered it when I explained the situation. Another pause. "It's red." "Red. Crimson, technically. Floor length. It's—" He hesitated in the way he hesitated when he was about to say something that he suspected she wasn't going to want to hear. "It fits you, Naomi. I checked the size." "It fits." She looked at him. "What aren't you saying?" "It's beautiful," he said, simply and without drama. "You're going to walk into that room and every eye in the place is going to find you before you reach the second step." "That's what I'm trying to avoid." "I know," he said. "But we have 2 hours and 11 minutes, and it's either the red dress or you go to a criminal syndicate negotiation in your office clothes." She looked at the monitor, then at the window, then at Marcus, who was looking at her with the specific expression of a man waiting for a woman who was about to make a decision she couldn't unmake. "Get the dress," she said. The Hotel Elysian on East Walton was the kind of place that had been built to make ordinary people feel small and wealthy people feel validated, which meant it served its purpose for exactly half its clientele and actively worked against the other half. Naomi had been in rooms like this her entire career. She had learned to move through them the way she moved through everything, with her chin level, her pace controlled, and her attention pointed inward even when every surface around her was trying to demand it. The lobby was already full when she arrived at 6:58, men in suits that cost more than car payments. Women in gowns that existed primarily as monuments to the fortunes behind them. Security personnel placed at intervals that looked casual and weren't. And beneath the surface of the polished, catered, chandelier-lit civility, tension. The specific electrically charged tension of a room where powerful men had agreed to stand near each other without reaching for weapons, and where that agreement was temporary and everyone in attendance knew it. Naomi had read every available intelligence brief on Julian Hawthorne during the 4 hours between Dominic's visit and her departure from the office. She had also, in those same 4 hours, identified the source of the $4.3 million. The name had confirmed something she had suspected for weeks, and it had made her very, very careful. She was carrying that information with her now, tucked into a small crimson clutch that matched the dress in a way that was probably Meredith's fault and couldn't be helped. She moved through the lobby. The first thing she registered was the silence that followed her. Not a literal silence. The room was full of noise, conversation, the careful soundtrack of a venue trying to suggest importance without effort. But as she crossed the marble floor, there was a specific quality of attention that followed her, a ripple of awareness that moved through the crowd the way a stone moves through still water. She felt it, and it made her jaw tighten, and she kept walking. Julian Hawthorne found her before she reached the first drink station. He was the kind of man who had spent his entire life learning how to look like he wasn't trying, and he had come very close to mastering it. British accent that he deployed selectively, turned up when he wanted to seem sophisticated, softened when he wanted to seem accessible, silver at his temples, which he wore like a credential, and eyes that were friendly in exactly the way that a locked door could look friendly from the outside. "Ms. Brooks." He said her name like he'd been practicing it, which he had been. "I've heard a great deal about you." "Mr. Hawthorne." She took a glass from a passing tray and did not offer her hand. "I've read a great deal about you." Something moved in his expression. A small recalibration. Most people, when he introduced himself, oriented toward him, leaned in slightly, softened slightly. This woman had done neither. "A financial mind like yours must find evenings like this somewhat tedious," he said, with the particular tone of a man who believed that flattery, properly administered, operated like a solvent. "I find evenings like this informative," she said. He smiled. "Perhaps we might find somewhere to talk." "We can talk here." Another recalibration, smaller this time, but she clocked it. "I'll be brief then. I have an opening in my operation for someone of your considerable capabilities. The compensation would make your current arrangement look. He tilted his head, searching for the word with practiced precision. Modest. Naomi looked at him. She took a small sip from her glass. The Meridian Trust account, she said. His smile stayed exactly where it was, but his eyes changed. I'm not sure The one registered to a holding company in Malta that doesn't exist anymore because it was dissolved in March. 6 weeks after the cartel that was funding your Rotterdam operation discovered that 2.8 million of their capital had been redirected into personal accounts tied to a property in the south of France that you own under your mother's maiden name. She paused. I found it this afternoon. I imagine they found it somewhat earlier than that, but chose not to act until they understood the full scope. She let that land. Would you like me to continue, or is this enough of an outline? The smile was gone. The room around them was still full of noise and crystal and the soft violence of men in expensive clothes making dangerous agreements, but the space immediately around Julian Hawthorne and Naomi Brooks had gone very, very still. You're making a significant mistake, he said. His voice had changed. The performance quality drained out of it, leaving something colder and more honest underneath. I make very few mistakes, she said. That's why I still have a job. You should think carefully, he said, about what it costs to have enemies. And that was the moment, the exact moment, she would think later, when she felt it. Not fear. Something older than fear. The specific awareness that the situation had moved past the point where words alone could contain it, and that the people in this building who were paid to escalate rather than de-escalate were paying close attention. She held his gaze. She did not step back. What she didn't see, what she couldn't see from where she was standing, was Dominic Vescari, 20 feet away, watching every second of it, watching the color in Julian Hawthorne's face, watching the way the man's body had oriented toward Naomi with a quality that he recognized immediately because he had seen it in rooms exactly like this one, pointed at people who had not always survived the evening. Dominic Vescari took one step forward, and then another, and the careful, constructed, dangerously balanced architecture of the night's negotiation began, quietly and catastrophically, to crack. Dominic Vescari did not run. Running was for men who had not yet learned that panic was visible, and visible panic was the fastest way to lose the kind of authority that took decades to build. So he walked. But the walk was different from his usual walk. There was a compression to it, a coiled quality in his shoulders and jaw that the men around him registered immediately, the way animals register a shift in atmospheric pressure before the storm makes itself visible to anyone else. His head of security, a broad, quiet man named Carver, who had been with him for 11 years, and who communicated primarily in subtle adjustments of posture, fell into step 3 feet behind him without being asked. 2 others followed, not because Dominic had signaled them, because they knew that walk. Julian Hawthorne was still talking when Dominic arrived. He was saying something about mistakes, about costs, about the particular arithmetic of having enemies in this city, and his voice had dropped to a register that was meant to be heard only by the person it was directed at, which meant it was a threat dressed in the clothing of private advice. Naomi was standing exactly as she had been, back straight, chin level, the crimson gown catching the light from the chandeliers above, in a way that made her look, from a distance, like something that had been built to withstand pressure. Up close, Dominic could see the tendons along her neck. He could see the slight controlled flare of her nostrils. She was not frightened. She was managing. There was a difference, and he knew it, and it made something in his chest do something he didn't have a clean word for. He stepped between them, not aggressively, not with the theatrical shoulder-first quality of a man performing dominance for an audience. He simply moved into the space between Naomi and Julian Hawthorne the way water moves into a gap, completely, immediately, and with the quiet suggestion that it had always been meant to be there. Hawthorne stopped mid-sentence. "Julian," Dominic said. Just the name. The way you'd say it to a dog that had walked into the wrong room. Hawthorne recovered quickly. He was good at recovering. "Dominic, we were just getting acquainted." "I watched you get acquainted." Dominic's voice was the same temperature it always was, which was to say it was the temperature of the room in winter. Not quite freezing, but close enough that you felt it in your lungs. That's enough of that. The men around Hawthorne, 3 of them, placed at intervals that had been designed to look casual and weren't, shifted. Nothing dramatic. Weight redistributed. Hands moved to positions of availability rather than rest. Carver, behind Dominic, noticed it and said nothing, which meant he had also signaled the other 2 men without making it a production. The ballroom around them continued its careful performance of normalcy. Crystal glasses, soft conversation, a string quartet playing something European and inoffensive in the far corner. But the bubble around this particular cluster of people had gone dense and very quiet, and the men and women near the edges of it were finding reasons to step back, to turn slightly, to create space. Because powerful people's bodies, even when controlled, communicated in frequencies that other powerful people could feel in their spines. Hawthorne smiled. It was his professional smile, the one built for rooms exactly like this one. I was simply extending a professional courtesy to Ms. Brooks. Nothing more. She doesn't need your courtesies. Perhaps she should speak for herself. Hawthorne's eyes moved to Naomi, and there was something in them now, something underneath the polish, that was neither professional nor courteous. I already did, Naomi said from behind Dominic's right shoulder. Her voice was level, completely, infuriatingly level. About 20 seconds before he arrived, Hawthorne's smile stayed in place, and his eyes went flat, which was the particular combination of expressions that Dominic had learned over many years in many rooms preceded the abandonment of subtlety. This is a negotiation, Hawthorne said, directing it at Dominic now. 2 organizations exploring a reasonable arrangement. What I don't understand is why you're... He paused, and in that pause placed something careful and deliberate. Secretary. Feels positioned to interfere with it. The word landed exactly the way it was thrown. Dominic did not move, did not blink, did not give Hawthorne the satisfaction of a visible reaction, because that was what the word had been designed to produce. A reaction, a denial, a clarification, anything that established that Naomi's presence required explanation. He had been in enough rooms to know that the first person who explained themselves in an exchange like this one had already begun to lose. But then something happened that he hadn't anticipated. Naomi stepped around him, not behind him, not to the side in the way of a person seeking cover. Around him, so that she was standing beside him, rather than behind him, in the space between him and Hawthorne, with her clutch held loosely in one hand and her expression composed with the particular patience of a woman who had spent her entire adult life having her credentials questioned by men who had fewer of them. Executive financial strategist, she said pleasantly. Not secretary, I apologize if the distinction was unclear. Hawthorne's eyes moved over her with the kind of deliberate slowness that was meant to make a person aware of being assessed, and Naomi looked back at him the way a surgeon looks at a particularly unremarkable scan, with professional interest and absolutely zero personal investment. The Meridian Trust, she said, the Malta Holding Company, the property in Provence under the name Sylviane Beaumont, which is your mother's name before she married your father, the 2.8 million that the Cali Consortium is currently trying to locate. She held his gaze. I didn't just find the thread this afternoon, Mr. Hawthorne. I pulled it, all of it, and what's at the end of it is, she tilted her head slightly. Well, it's not favorable for you. The string quartet continued playing in the far corner. Someone near the bar laughed at something, the sound bright and foreign. Julian Hawthorne's face did something in that moment that his professional smile could not fully contain. It was brief, half a second, maybe less, but Dominic caught it, and Carver caught it, and Naomi, who had been watching for exactly that, caught it too. It was the expression of a man who had walked into a room believing he held every card and had just discovered that someone had been dealing from a different deck entirely. Then it was gone, and what replaced it was something colder and less negotiable. You've made a significant error in judgment tonight, Hawthorne said, and the performance quality was entirely absent from his voice now. He was looking at Naomi, but the statement was aimed at Dominic. Both of you. We'll see, Dominic said. Yes, Hawthorne said. You will. He turned and walked back toward his people. His security detail closed around him with the smooth, practiced efficiency of men who had been through transitions like this before. The bubble broke. The tension didn't. Dominic turned to Naomi. We need to talk. Not here. No, he agreed. Not here. She was already moving. The room they found was a conference suite on the hotel's third floor, accessed through a door near the service corridor that Carver knew about, because Carver knew about every service corridor in every building in a 12-block radius of wherever Dominic Viscari was likely to be on a given evening. Old habit, good habit. The kind of habit that had kept both of them alive through situations that neither of them discussed at length. The room was cold and functional. A long table, 12 chairs, a credenza with a water pitcher, recessed lighting that gave everything a slightly institutional quality. The gala continued 3 floors below them, muffled by carpet and concrete and the specific insulation of a building designed to contain the sounds of important people doing important things without disturbing anyone. Naomi set her clutch on the table and looked at it for a moment before looking at Dominic. You shouldn't have done that, she said. He was threatening you. He was testing me. There's a difference, and you know it, and what you just did turned a test into a declaration. She pulled out a chair but didn't sit in it. Every syndicate leader in that room watched you step in front of me. Every one of them is now doing the math on what that means. Let them do the math. Dominic. His name in her mouth had a quality it didn't have when other people said it. Not softer, sharper, actually. More precise, though the way a scalpel is more precise than a blade. If they figure out if they understand what I am to you, then I become leverage. You know this. You've always known this. It's why we have never... She stopped, picked up the water pitcher, put it back down without pouring anything. It's why there are protocols. He watched her move around the table with her hands looking for something to do, and he thought, this is what she does when she's afraid. Not scream, not freeze, not fall apart. Move, organize, convert the fear into momentum. He had watched her do it for 6 years, and he had never said anything about it because saying something about it would have meant admitting that he had been watching closely enough to see it. The protocols, he said, assume that no one in that room already knows. She stopped. What? He sat down then, which was unusual for him in a working conversation. He thought better on his feet, and everyone who worked with him knew it, and the fact that he sat meant that what he was about to say required a different kind of weight behind it. The 4.3 million. You said you identified the source. Before I left the office. Yes. Tell me. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pulled out the chair she'd been standing behind and sat across from him, and reached into the crimson clutch, and produced a folded piece of paper, actual paper, handwritten notes, because Naomi Brooks did not put the things she couldn't afford to lose onto anything with a network connection. She slid it across the table. He looked at the name. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he set the paper down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and looked at a point approximately 8 inches above the surface of the conference table. How long? He said. Based on the transaction pattern, I think the diversion started 14 months ago, but there are irregularities going back almost 2 years that could indicate groundwork, testing, seeing what was possible. She paused. He's been careful. If I hadn't been looking for something specific tonight, I might not have found it for another 3 months. But you were looking for something specific. Yes. Because of Hawthorne. Because 3 weeks ago I noticed a change in the pattern of how certain internal reports were being filtered before they reached me. Small changes. The kind that only register if you're tracking document metadata, which most people don't. She folded her hands on the table. Someone was making sure that I wasn't seeing a complete picture. I started going back through everything I'd been shown in the last 18 months and looking for what wasn't there. Dominic looked at the name on the paper again. He's been with me for 9 years. I know. He was at my brother's. He stopped. Something crossed his face. 9 years. People change their priorities, Naomi said, and there was no cruelty in it and no softness either, just the plain acknowledgement of a fact that hurt and was still a fact. Or the right offer comes along. Or they convince themselves that what they're doing is justified, and then they do it long enough that the justification calcifies into something they don't even examine anymore. Hawthorne got to him. I believe so. I can't prove the direct connection yet, but the timing of the first diversion corresponds with a conference in Miami where your man and 3 of Hawthorne's senior financial people were all registered. Same hotel. I pulled the flight manifest. She tapped the folded paper. The wire trails and the conference overlap are on the back. He turned the paper over and looked at it. She had done this in 4 hours. Between running the original analysis that had identified the theft, managing whatever else was on her desk, dressing for an event she hadn't planned for, and walking into a ballroom full of criminal organizations with the collected composure of a woman attending a routine business function. In 4 hours. He had hired her for her mind. He had never stopped being astonished by it. He looked up from this paper and found her watching him with an expression that was careful and tired, and something else underneath that she had been careful about for as long as he'd known her. "The name can't leave this room tonight," he said. "I know. If he gets any indication that we know, he'll run, and if he runs, he takes whatever he's already given Hawthorne with him, and we lose the ability to control the scope of the damage." She had clearly already run this sequence. She had probably run it multiple times on the drive to the hotel. "We need him in place. We need him thinking tonight went the way Hawthorne planned it, which means," she looked at the table, "which means what happened downstairs is a problem. He was going to threaten you regardless. The only variable was whether or not I was standing there when he did it. You changed the stakes." He changed the stakes the moment he came to Chicago. Dominic's voice was still controlled, but there was something moving underneath it, a current, the kind that didn't show on the surface of deep water and could still pull you under. "What was I supposed to do, Naomi? Watch?" She met his eyes. The question sat in the room between them with all its actual weight, which was considerably more than its surface suggested. "What was I supposed to watch?" "You being threatened. You standing your ground in a room full of men who would burn every protocol to the ground if they understood what you mean to me. You, in that dress, alone." She was the first to look away. "We have a bigger problem," she said. Tell me. "When I told Hawthorne about the Malta account and the Provence property." She paused. His reaction, the way it landed, it was wrong. Dominic waited. "He wasn't surprised that I knew," she said. "He was surprised by the specific details, but not by the fact of it. Not by the fact that someone from your organization had dug into his finances." She looked at the table. "Which means he expected scrutiny. Which means he expected to be investigated. Which means he came in wanting to be caught," Dominic said slowly. "Not caught. Seen. He came in wanting us to know he was dangerous, wanting to establish the terms of a confrontation, not avoid one." She pressed 2 fingers to her temple briefly. "The gala was never about negotiation. It was about provocation. He wanted us reactive. He wanted you to do exactly what you just did downstairs." She looked up. "The shipping routes, the Port Authority contracts, whatever his actual play is tonight, he needed us focused on the personal, not the financial. And now we are." The silence between them was not the comfortable silence of 2 people who had worked together long enough to be quiet without discomfort. It was the specific, pressurized silence of 2 people who had just understood something bad, simultaneously, and were holding it before either of them said it out loud. Downstairs, the gala was still running. 300 people. The kind of evening that generated its own gravity, pulled people into it, and made the world outside seem temporarily less real. Somewhere down there, a man whose name was written on a piece of paper in Dominic Viscari's pocket was moving through that crowd, carrying information he had been paid to carry, believing that tonight had gone according to a plan that Naomi had just taken apart with 6 hours of work and a handful of handwritten notes. And somewhere down there, Julian Hawthorne was doing something. Whatever it was the thing he had actually come to Chicago to do. And they were 3 floors away from it, and the clock that mattered was not the one on the wall. Naomi was already standing when Dominic reached the door. "We go back down," she said, "separately." Obviously separately. She picked up her clutch. "Give me 4 minutes. I need to make a call before we go back in." "To who?" She looked at him with the expression she used when the answer to a question was something she had already handled. "To the person monitoring Hawthorne's external communications. I set it up this afternoon. If he's made any outgoing contact in the last 40 minutes, I want to know who he called and how long he was on." Dominic stared at her. "You set up surveillance on Hawthorne's communications this afternoon, while you were also tracking $4 million and getting dressed for a gala. 3 things can happen simultaneously," she said. "That's the whole point of preparation." She moved toward the door. 4 minutes. He watched her go. The door closed. He stood in the empty conference room with the piece of paper in his hand and the name on it, and the accumulated weight of a situation that had been building toward this for longer than he'd understood. And he breathed in once, slow, deliberate, and breathed out. And the breath was the only luxury he allowed himself, because the next 40 minutes were going to require everything he had, and some things he wasn't sure he still had, and absolutely no margin for anything that looked like hesitation. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. The text was from a number he recognized as one of the perimeter security contacts stationed outside the hotel. It said 4 words. 4 words that meant the situation he'd been managing for the last 30 minutes had just become something categorically different. It said, Hawthorne's men. Back entrance. Armed. Dominic put the phone in his pocket, straightened his jacket, and walked out the door. 3 floors below, the string quartet was still playing. The chandeliers were still burning, the crystal was still catching the light. And the architecture of the evening, the careful, dangerous, meticulously constructed architecture of men who had agreed to be civilized for one night, was cracking through its foundation with the speed and the quiet of something that had been breaking for a very long time, and had simply been waiting for the right moment to finish. That moment was now. 4 words. Dominic stood in the hallway outside the conference room and read them again, the way you read something that doesn't make immediate sense, not because the words are difficult, but because the implications are too large to absorb in a single pass. Hawthorne's men. Back entrance. Armed. He had been in this business long enough to know the difference between a show of force and a deployment. A show of force was visible. Men at the front entrance, hands visible, positioned where the people inside could see them and understand the message. A deployment was quiet. Back entrance, service corridors. The kind of positioning that wasn't about intimidation, it was about containment. Hawthorne hadn't come to Chicago to negotiate. He hadn't come to provoke. He had come to finish something, and the gala was the container he had chosen to finish it in, and every person in that ballroom was currently inside that container without knowing it. Dominic typed 3 characters to Carver and moved toward the stairwell. The stairwell smelled like industrial cleaner and old concrete, the hotel's bones exposed in a way, its lobby carefully concealed. His footsteps were loud in the enclosed space, and he took them faster than he should have for a man trying to appear unhurried, and by the time he pushed through the door onto the second-floor landing, he had already run the scenario 3 times in his head and arrived at the same conclusion each time. There were 300 people in the ballroom. Naomi was somewhere in this building making a phone call. The man whose name was on the paper in his pocket was somewhere in this building, and he had known about tonight's deployment before it happened, which meant he had fed the timeline to Hawthorne, which meant Hawthorne knew exactly how much security Dominic had in place and exactly where it was positioned, which meant the perimeter was already compromised in ways that 4 words in a text message hadn't begun to cover. He found Carver at the base of the main staircase, positioned with his back to the wall and his eyes on the ballroom entrance. The body language said, "I know." The expression said, "It's worse than the text." "How many?" Dominic said without stopping, Carver falling into step beside him. "Minimum 6 at the back. Probable 2 on the roof of the building across the street. Renner spotted laser optics at 11 o'clock during the last sweep." Carver kept his voice at the specific low frequency that carried only as far as the person beside him. "2 of our people at the East Service exit aren't responding to check-ins, started 6 minutes ago." Options. Controlled evacuation through the north lobby exit. We can move the principals out in under 4 minutes if we start now. Carver paused. "But if Hawthorne's people are positioned to discourage exits, we risk pushing civilians into..." "He won't touch civilians." "You sure about that?" Dominic wasn't. That was the honest answer, and Carver knew it, and neither of them said it out loud. Julian Hawthorne had operated in 4 countries across 2 decades, and his record was not a clean one. And the category of things he considered acceptable had never been publicly tested against a room full of 300 people at a charity gala. But Dominic had read his file, and Naomi had read it more carefully, and the consensus was that Hawthorne was precise. He preferred surgical damage to collateral damage, because collateral damage generated the kind of attention that made business difficult. The room, then, was probably not the target. The question was, what was? "Find Naomi," Dominic said. "3rd floor, East Conference Suite. Get her to the north stairwell and keep her there until I signal. Carver's expression did something small and controlled. She's not going to... Tell her it's an order. With respect, Carver said, she's going to tell me what she tells me every time you invoke that word. Then tell her it's a request. Tell her whatever gets her to the stairwell, Carver. Go. Carver went. Dominic pushed through the ballroom doors. The room had shifted in the 40 minutes he had been away from it. Not visibly. The chandeliers were still blazing. The string quartet was still working through their repertoire, and the surface of the evening maintained its glossy, catered composure. But the people in the room had rearranged themselves in ways that told a different story. Hawthorne's people had spread out from their original cluster near the bar. They were positioned now at intervals that looked social and weren't, near the exits, near the windows, near the points in the room where a person trying to leave quickly would have to pass through or past them. Not a show of force. A net. Dominic moved through the room with his hands loose and his face arranged into the expression he wore when he needed people to believe nothing was happening. He had been wearing that expression since he was 19 years old. He was very good at it. He found Elias Morrow near the east window. Morrow was 51, with the lean, carefully maintained quality of a man who had never allowed himself to run soft, and a face that had always communicated trustworthiness in the specific way that faces communicate things their owners have worked to project, through a studied openness, a quality of attentiveness, the small gestures of a man who wanted you to believe he was always listening. He had been listening, it turned out, just not to Dominic, 9 years. Dominic stopped beside him at the window. Below them, East Walton Street was quiet. A cab at the curb. A couple walking a dog bundled against the November cold, unhurried. The ordinary machinery of the city, indifferent to what was happening above it. Beautiful night, Morrow said. He had a glass in his hand. He had probably had it in his hand all evening, maintaining a consistent level without drinking much of it, which was the behavior of a man who needed to stay sharp while appearing relaxed. Dominic noticed this now. He wondered how many other times he had watched Morrow do it without reading it correctly. Walk with me, Dominic said. Morrow turned from the window with the expression of a man who had no particular reason not to, and they moved together through the room in the direction of the far hallway, and nobody who watched them saw anything other than two men in suits having a conversation at a gala, which was the most ordinary sight in the room. The hallway was quieter. Alcove near the coat check unoccupied. Dominic stopped there. Morrow stopped 2 feet away and looked at him with the open, attentive expression he had spent 9 years perfecting. 14 months, Dominic said. Something happened in Morrow's face, extremely brief. Then the expression settled back, but it settled into a version that was slightly different from before, less performed, more considered, as if the effort of maintenance had become, in that 1 second, too expensive to sustain. I don't know what you're... Don't. Dominic's voice was quiet. Absolutely, entirely quiet. The kind of quiet that in his experience had preceded more violence than any amount of shouting. I have the transaction records. I have the Malta connection. I have the Miami conference manifests. He paused. I have 14 months, Elias. Morrow was still for a moment. The glass in his hand didn't move. The expression on his face did something complicated and human and exhausted that Dominic had not expected, which was the one thing that made what happened next more difficult than the calculation it should have been. How long have you known? Morrow said. The performance was gone. The voice was different, older, flatter, without the manufactured warmth that had characterized every conversation they'd had for the better part of a decade. Since 11 o'clock tonight. Who found it? Dominic didn't answer. Morrow laughed. It was a short, hollow sound that had nothing of humor in it. Of course. He looked at the glass in his hand and set it carefully on the narrow ledge of the coat check window. She's extraordinary, you know. I told Hawthorne she was the one variable he hadn't properly accounted for. He disagreed. He has a way of underestimating women with... He stopped. Anyway, he was wrong. What did you give him? Dom. What did you give him, Elias? The name. The shortened name. The one that only the people who had been in Dominic's life long enough to earn the informality used. Morrow closed his eyes briefly when he heard it, then opened them. The Port Authority's schedule for the next 6 months. the routing codes for the Midwest Distribution Network, the names of the 4 city council members on your payroll. He said it the way a person recites something they have repeated internally many times, with the flat cadence of a list long since memorized. He needed the council names specifically. He has someone in the mayor's office working a zoning play for the South Lakefront property, and he needed to know which members were already purchased, so he'd know which ones were still available to the security protocols for tonight. Morrow was quiet. You gave him the security protocols for tonight. The quiet stretched for 3 seconds. 4. Then Morrow said, I gave him the staffing numbers, the entry points, the external perimeter positions. He looked at the window. Not because I wanted people hurt. You know I didn't. I know you did it anyway. He was going to take the port contracts regardless, with or without me. The arrangement was, he was going to get what he came for, Dom. I was trying to position us to survive the transition, trying to make sure we came out of it with enough still standing to, by handing him the keys to a building with 300 people in it. Morrow flinched. It was genuine. That was the worst part. The flinch was real, which meant somewhere inside the architecture of the justifications he had constructed for himself over 14 months, he had always known exactly what this moment would look like. And he had done it anyway. And the flinch was the evidence of the gap between what he'd known and what he'd chosen. People lived in that gap. Dominic had seen it his entire adult life. It never got easier to look at. What's his play tonight? Dominic said. Specifically, what's he moving for? I don't know the specifics of the Elias, the quiet voice again. I have 6 people I can't reach on my perimeter. I have armed men at my back entrance. I have a room full of people who don't know they're locked in. So whatever you know and whatever you're deciding right now about whether to tell me, I need you to understand that the clock on this conversation is very short. Morrow looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through his face that wasn't regret exactly. It was older than regret, deeper than remorse. The particular expression of a man who has arrived at the consequence he told himself he'd outrun and found it waiting exactly where consequences tend to wait. The servers, he said, your financial network, the offshore accounts, the domestic shell structures, the transaction routing for the last 8 years. He looked at the floor. He has a team in your building right now. Not this building, Vescari Tower. Your operations center on 41. They're copying everything. The sentence landed in Dominic's chest like something physical. He stood with it for the second it required, and then he moved past it, because there was no alternative to moving past it, because standing in the impact of information that large, in a hallway at a gala with armed men at the exits, was a luxury that did not exist. How long have they been in the building? Since 7:30. When your security detail relocated here, the reduced overnight staff at the tower, Morrow stopped. He planned it for tonight specifically because of the gala. Because you'd be here, because your best people would be here, and your building would be running on secondary staff who don't report to Carver. Dominic was already calculating. The operations center on 41 had a local server architecture with a tiered access system. A copy operation of the full financial network would take, depending on the equipment they brought in, somewhere between 40 minutes and 2 hours. What time did they go in? 7:30. He looked at his watch, 8:44:74 minutes. He turned and walked back toward the ballroom doors, and his mind was doing something it did in moments of genuine crisis. Not panicking, not freezing, but moving at a speed that left his body slightly behind so that his legs carried him forward while his brain was already 3 steps ahead, working the problem the only way it could be worked, which was from the inside out, because the outside was already beyond his control. He pushed through the doors, crossed the ballroom, pulled out his phone. Naomi picked up on the first ring. I know, she said. He stopped walking. You know, the communications intercept. I set up this afternoon. The team Hawthorne put in your building triggered a motion sensor on 41 at 7:28. The person monitoring the intercept flagged it to me 2 minutes ago. Her voice was even. It was the evenness of someone who had processed a shock and come out the other side of it into the specific cold clarity that follows. I'm looking at the access logs remotely right now. They're in the server room. They're copying. How much time? At their current transfer rate? 30 minutes, maybe 35. 30 minutes. The operations data of 8 years. the financial DNA of everything Dominic Vescari had built. Can you stop it remotely? A pause. 2 seconds. Normally, no. The security architecture requires physical access to the... Another pause, briefer. Wait. He waited. Around him, the gala continued its performance. Chandeliers, crystal, the string quartet still playing. There's a back door, she said. I built it in 2 years ago when I restructured the server architecture after the Henderson audit. I built in a remote lockdown protocol as a contingency for exactly this kind of... She stopped. I never told you about it. Why not? Because the existence of a back door is a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities get used by people who know about them, and I decided that the safest version of that protocol was the one only I knew about. A beat. I realize how that sounds right now. Can you trigger it from here? Yes. But if I lock the servers down remotely, the copy operation stops. But so does everything else. Every transaction in process, every active account. The entire financial network goes dark until someone physically unlocks the system from the operations center. She paused. It would also alert the team in the building that someone knows what they're doing, and if Hawthorne is monitoring the building remotely, which I have to assume he is, he'll know within 30 seconds that the operation is blown. And then he moves. And then whatever he has positioned outside this building moves. Yes. Dominic looked across the ballroom. Hawthorne was standing near the bar, a fresh drink in his hand, talking to 2 men from the St. Louis operation with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed his evening was proceeding exactly as planned. His eyes moved across the room with the casual sweep of a man surveilling from behind a social mask, and for one fraction of a second they found Dominic's. And something passed between them. Acknowledgement, recognition, the understanding of 2 men who had both just realized that the other knew, and then Hawthorne looked away and smiled at something one of the St. Louis men had said. Naomi, Dominic said. Yes. Trigger the lockdown. Silence. 1 breath. 2. If I do this, she said, we lose the financial network for a minimum of 6 hours. During those 6 hours, we can't move money, can't close positions, can't access any of the reserve accounts. If Hawthorne moves against the port contracts tonight, if he gets everything on those servers, he doesn't need to move against anything. He'll already have won. Dominic's voice was completely flat. Trigger it. Another beat. Then, it's done. Across the ballroom, Julian Hawthorne's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. Dominic watched him reach for it with the unhurried motion of a man expecting a routine update. Look at the screen and go very still. Then Hawthorne looked up, and across 300 people in a string quartet and enough crystal to fill a small lake, his eyes found Dominic Vescari's with an expression that had nothing polished or performative left in it, just cold, direct fury. The expression of a man whose plan had just been cut off at the knees, and who understood in that same instant that the damage was contained and that the person who had contained it was not the man he was looking at. Mr. Vescari. Hawthorne's voice, when it came, was loud enough to carry, loud enough to pull heads. The string quartet faltered and went quiet. I think we've moved past the portion of the evening where pretending serves either of us. The room shifted. The specific quality of attention that fills a space when the social contract has just been visibly torn. I think you're right, Dominic said. Hawthorne set his glass down. Your woman just cost you everything. She just saved everything. That's a different thing, and you know it. For tonight. Hawthorne took 1 step forward, then another, and the men around him, his men, the ones distributed through the room at their social-looking intervals, stopped pretending and oriented. But tonight is one night, Dominic, and I have more nights than you have resources to cover them. He smiled, and it was the last smile, the one that had no warmth and no performance behind it, just the naked expression of a man stating a fact he believed in completely. Where is she? The question hung in the air of the ballroom. 300 people, not breathing. She's exactly where she needs to be, Dominic said, and reached for the single thing he had told himself he would never do in a public room, in front of witnesses, in a building full of people who would remember and report and use what they saw. He reached for his phone and made the call that ended the negotiation and started the war, because there was nothing left to negotiate, because the man across the room had come to Chicago to take everything, and the only currency left was force, and the only question that remained was whose force arrived first. Somewhere above them, on the 41st floor of Vescari Tower, a server room had gone dark, and Naomi Brooks, 3 floors above this ballroom, in a stairwell that smelled like concrete and old metal, was already building the counterattack. The call Dominic made lasted 11 seconds. He said 4 things to the person on the other end. He said, "The building is compromised, pull the team out now. The north exit is clean, and don't stop moving." Then he ended the call and put the phone in his pocket and looked across the ballroom at Julian Hawthorne with the specific expression of a man who has just burned down every remaining bridge and is standing in the smoke deciding what to build next. Hawthorne was already moving, not toward Dominic. That would have been the emotional choice, the satisfying choice, the choice of a man who operated on ego rather than calculation. Hawthorne moved toward the exit, but at an angle, a controlled diagonal through the crowd that was designed to create confusion about his destination, and the men positioned around the ballroom moved with him, tightening, and the whole thing had the quality of a formation rather than a retreat. He was leaving, not running, executing. Carver materialized at Dominic's elbow from a direction that made no spatial sense. "North exit is clear. I've got Tomas and Webb on the perimeter at Walton, 2 SUVs at the curb." Hawthorne's moving for the east side. "I see him. Don't touch him in the building." Dominic was already walking, cutting a line through the crowd at an angle that would intercept Hawthorne's path to the east corridor without producing the specific optics of one crime boss chasing another through a charity gala. 300 witnesses. Understood. The crowd parted for Dominic the way crowds always parted for him. Not because he asked, but because something in the way he moved communicated a priority that the body registered before the brain caught up. People stepped aside. Conversations interrupted themselves. Heads turned and then turned away again, with the instinct of people who understood, at some animal level, that the thing moving through the room was not something they wanted to be adjacent to right now. He was 12 feet from the east corridor entrance when his phone buzzed. Naomi. He picked up without breaking stride. "Talk!" The team in the building. Her voice had a quality he had heard from her exactly twice before in 6 years. Not panic, nothing approaching panic, but a compression, a tightness, the sound of a mind running at a speed that was costing something. They didn't stop when the servers locked down. They're still in the operations center, which means they're not there for the financial data. He stopped walking. 3 feet in front of him, the east corridor. Through it, Hawthorne and his men moving with purpose and speed toward whatever exit they had chosen. Then what are they there for? "I don't know yet. I'm pulling the building's internal camera feed. Give me 90 seconds. He stood in the middle of the Hotel Elysian ballroom while 300 people swirled around him and Julian Hawthorne disappeared into the east corridor, and the string quartet, recovered from its earlier interruption, began playing again with the slightly heightened tempo of musicians who could feel the room and were trying to compensate with volume. He stood there and breathed and waited. 45 seconds. 60. Dominic. Her voice had changed. The compression was still there, but it had acquired a different quality underneath it. Something colder. "They're in your office, the 43rd floor. They bypassed the server room entirely. That was a diversion. They've been in your office for the last hour." "My office is clean. Nothing physically there that—" "Your secondary drive." A beat. "The one in the false bottom of the center desk drawer. The one with the contingency files." He felt something go cold in his chest that had nothing to do with the November air coming through the lobby doors 20 feet away. The contingency files were not financial records. They were not transaction histories or routing codes or the names of purchased politicians. The contingency files were the documentation he had assembled over 12 years of operating in a world where trust was the rarest currency and everyone eventually disappointed you. Records of agreements, of leverage, of the specific vulnerabilities of every significant player in Chicago's underworld and half of the legitimate power structure above it. Insurance, the kind that kept men who wanted to move against you from moving because moving against you meant you released what you had on them. And what you had on them was enough to end careers and, in several cases, end freedom. The contingency files were the reason Dominic Vescari had survived for 22 years in a business where the average operational lifespan was considerably shorter. If Hawthorne had them, can they copy the drive? It's encrypted, but the encryption... She paused. The pause was 3 seconds long, which for Naomi was an eternity. I designed the encryption, which means I know its limits. And if Hawthorne brought in someone who knows cryptographic architecture at a high enough level, they could crack it in. Another pause. 8 to 12 hours. We have 8 to 12 hours. We have less. Because if they have the physical drive, they don't need to crack it here. They can walk out of the building with it and crack it anywhere in the world. Her voice was steady, and the steadiness was costing her. He could hear it. I need to know if they've taken it. I need building security on 43 right now, but if I trigger a building security response and they have people watching, they'll move faster. Yes, the east corridor was empty now. Hawthorne was gone. The building's lobby through the glass doors showed the street, the cabs, the ordinary November night, and somewhere in that night Hawthorne's cars were pulling away from a curb, and his phone was receiving updates from a team on the 43rd floor of a building 12 blocks away, and every second of this conversation was a second of the lead time they could not recover. "Where are you?" he said. "Second floor stairwell, east side. Stay there." "Dominic, I mean it, 2 minutes." He didn't wait for her response. He moved. The service elevator was at the back of the hotel's kitchen corridor, past the organized chaos of catering staff and rolling carts, and the dense, hot smell of food being produced at scale. Carver had the elevator held. They rode it to the parking level in silence, and then they were in the SUV, and then they were on East Walton heading west toward Michigan, and Dominic called the building's overnight security chief, a man named Paulson who had been on his payroll for 3 years and who picked up on the second ring with the voice of a man who had already been having a difficult evening. 43, Dominic said. Right now. How many people? Mr. Vescari, there's been a situation. Paulson's voice had the specific fractured quality of a man simultaneously managing multiple things and managing none of them well. We had a report of a medical emergency on 41 at 8:15. We diverted 2 of the overnight team to... That was a diversion. Dominic's voice came out harder than he intended. The medical emergency was manufactured. Who do you have on 43 right now? Nobody, sir. With the redeployment for the medical, get someone up there. Get them up there now and do not use the elevator. Use the north stairwell and do not... He stopped himself. If Hawthorne's team was still in the building and a security guard walked in on them, the outcome for the security guard was not one Dominic wanted on his conscience or his record. No, hold your people. Keep them off 43. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Nobody goes to 43 until I get there. Nobody. If anyone tries to access that floor from any direction, I want to know immediately. He ended the call. The SUV was moving through Michigan Avenue traffic, the Chicago night streaming past the windows in smears of light and motion. 11 minutes to the tower, maybe 9 if the lights cooperated. 9 minutes was a very long time. His phone buzzed. Naomi. I'm pulling the building elevator logs, she said without preamble. She was moving. He could hear footsteps, the sound of a door, the ambient shift of her changing locations. They came in on the service elevator at 7:29, 3 of them. They went directly to 41, which confirmed the server room story, but one of them split off at 42. I can see it in the floor sensor data, and went to 43 alone. One person. One, but they've been up there for over an hour, which means either they're being very thorough or... Footsteps. Faster now. Or they had trouble with the desk. The drawer is reinforced. You need a specific tool to open the false bottom without destroying it. And if they didn't know about the reinforcement, did Morrow know about it? Silence. 3 seconds. Hot. I don't know, she said, and the admission cost her visibly even across a phone connection. I don't know what Morrow knew about the physical layout of your office. He's been in there dozens of times. He's observant. He could have... She stopped. I genuinely don't know. Where are you right now? I'm in the lobby of the hotel. I told Carver you gave permission. I told Carver to keep you in the stairwell. Carver told me that. I explained that his instructions and my intentions were not compatible, and I left. A beat. I'm getting in a cab. Don't argue with me, Dominic. Whatever is on that drive is what this whole night has been about. I know the encryption better than anyone else. If there's any chance of stopping the copy or corrupting the transfer, If there's a man on 43, then there's a man on 43, and I'll deal with that when I get there. How far out are you? He looked at the street. 7 minutes. I'll be 4 minutes behind you. The sound of a cab door, street noise, muffled. Don't go up alone. I have Carver. I don't mean tactically. A pause that was different from her other pauses. Shorter, but with more in it. I mean, don't make any decisions about what's on that drive without me in the room. Those files affect both of us. Some of what's on there, she stopped again. Some of what's on that drive is documentation I put together, that I built. That has my fingerprints on it in ways that go beyond employment. He understood what she was saying. The contingency files included records of financial operations that Naomi had architected. Not criminal, not directly. She had always operated in the space between strategy and illegality with the precision of a surgeon who knows exactly where the artery is and exactly how close you can cut without severing it. But in the hands of the right prosecutor, or the wrong journalist, or a man like Julian Hawthorne who understood how to apply leverage. 4 minutes, he said. 4 minutes, she confirmed. The line went quiet, but neither of them disconnected. He rode the remaining 7 minutes to the Viscari Tower in the back of the SUV, with the phone in his hand and the city moving past the windows and the specific silence of a person listening to another person breathe, which was not nothing in a night that had been doing its best to take everything. The Viscari Tower lobby was marble in silence. The overnight desk was staffed by a young man named Griffin, who had the particular look of someone who had been told to act normally and was failing at it, which told Dominic that Paulson had already briefed him. He moved past Griffin without stopping, and Carver had the executive elevator held. 43 floors in a building this height took 42 seconds. Dominic counted them. The doors opened onto the executive floor, which was dark except for the emergency lighting. A dim, bluish wash that turned the carpet and the clean lines of the hallway into something from a different category of space than the polished environment it was in daylight. His office was at the end of the hall, 60 feet. The door was open, not all the way. 8 inches, maybe 10, with a thin line of light coming through it that wasn't emergency lighting, artificial. A work light or a phone light or a flashlight, the specific warm quality of directed illumination rather than overhead. Carver put a hand on Dominic's arm. 1 second. He moved forward himself, covering the approach to the office with the professional economy of a man who had done this kind of work long enough to have made it automatic. And Dominic followed 3 steps behind with his heart doing something it did not usually do, which was to make itself audible. He could hear his own pulse. Carver hit the door with his shoulder. The man inside was fast. Faster than someone who had been sitting at a desk for an hour had any right to be. He came off the chair with the specific trained quality of a person whose reaction to sudden entry is not flight, but immediate counteraction. And the first thing he did was not run for the window or the door, but reach for the drive in the center desk drawer, which told Dominic exactly what the priority was before any words had been exchanged. Carver got to him before the drive left the drawer. What happened next was brief, loud, and left a lamp on the floor, a chair on its side, and Carver with a split along his left cheekbone that was going to require attention. The man was good, professional grade good, but Carver was Carver, and the man ended up against the far wall with his arm behind him and his face pressed against the mahogany paneling, breathing in ragged pulls, and the drive was on the desk where the drawer had been. And the question now was what had been done to it before Carver came through the door. Dominic picked it up. It looked undisturbed. The casing was intact. The connection port showed no visible damage. But looking undisturbed and being undisturbed were two different things, and the only person who could tell him which one this was arrived 6 minutes later, coming through the office door with her heels in her left hand and the crimson gown catching the office's work light in a way that had no business being as striking as it was, given what the evening had been. Naomi looked at Carver's face, then at the man against the wall, then at the drive in Dominic's hand. She crossed the room and took it from him without asking, which he had expected, and she sat down in his chair and pulled a cable from the clutch she was still somehow carrying and connected the drive to the secondary laptop she had brought from wherever she had produced it and started working. Nobody spoke. The man against the wall tried once to say something, and Carver applied a small, specific pressure that discouraged further conversation. Naomi worked. Her hands moved with the particular focused speed of a person operating in the narrow corridor between competent and brilliant. and her face was arranged in the expression she wore when she was inside a problem. Not blank, not concentrated in the furrowed performative way of someone who wanted to look like they were thinking, but genuinely absent, present only in the part of her that was processing. Everything else running on a kind of automatic that she had developed over years of needing to function at full capacity while her environment did its best to destabilize her. 4 minutes. Then 5. Then she stopped, set her hands flat on the desk, looked at the screen for 3 more seconds with an expression that Dominic could not immediately parse. "He copied it," she said. The room was very quiet. "When?" Dominic said. "The copy completed at 9:07, 11 minutes before we got here." She looked at the screen. "He transferred the decrypted portion. They got through about 30% of the encryption before the drive locked them out, which means they have 30%. They have 30%. She looked up. The first third of the contingency files, organized chronologically, which means the oldest material. Some of it is outdated. Some of it has already been superseded by changes in... She stopped. Her jaw tightened in the way it tightened when she was processing something she didn't want to have to say. But some of it is current, and some of it is... She looked at the screen again. Some of it is the kind of documentation that ends careers even when the underlying actions were legal. He said... "Whose careers?" She looked at him. "Mine," she said. "Specifically, the restructuring work I did in 2019 on the offshore holding network. It was legal. Every piece of it was legal, but in the wrong framing, presented without context, it looks like..." She pressed her lips together. "It looks like exactly the kind of thing they would use to destroy credibility. My credibility." The silence was specific this time. It had a shape. She had been protecting his organization for 6 years. She had protected it tonight at the cost of her own financial exposure. And the thing Hawthorne had taken, the thing he was carrying in a car somewhere in Chicago right now, was not a weapon against Dominic's operation. It was a weapon against her. That was the play. That was what all of it had been building toward. Not the port contracts, not the shipping empire, not the political leverage. Hawthorne had come to Chicago to take Naomi Brooks off the board, because without her, the organization was vulnerable in ways that no amount of force or money could compensate for. Without her, the financial architecture collapsed. Without her, the thing Dominic had built over 22 years became just another criminal enterprise with muscle and ambition and no real mind behind it. Hawthorne had understood this before Dominic had been willing to say it out loud. He had targeted her, specifically and with precision, and the entire evening, the gala, the provocation, the server room diversion, the confrontation in the ballroom, all of it had been designed to keep them in this building, while a man with a copy drive walked out of the Vescari Tower with 30% of the evidence needed to dismantle the one person who made the whole structure hold. Dominic looked at Naomi. She was looking at the screen. Her shoulders were down from where they'd been carrying the tension of the night. Her hands were flat on the desk and very still, and in the bluish emergency light mixed with the work lamp, the crimson dress looked like something else entirely. Less like an accident, less like a gown that didn't belong to her, and more like the thing she'd been wearing all along. The thing underneath the navy suits and the professional distance, and the 6 years of careful, precise, invisible work. "Tell me what you need," he said. She looked up. The expression on her face had gone through several things in the last 10 seconds, and what it had arrived at was something he recognized because he had seen it only a handful of times in 6 years, and each time it had preceded something that changed the shape of whatever situation they were in. It was the expression she wore when she had already decided. "I need 12 hours, she said. "I need access to every financial network Hawthorne has touched in the last 3 years. I need the identity of the person receiving the transferred data, who he's sending it to and where. And I need you to keep him in Chicago until I'm finished." She held his gaze. "Can you do that?" "The last part." "The last part," she confirmed. Dominic looked at this man against the wall, then at Carver, who had a hand pressed to his cheek and the steady eyes of a man waiting for direction. Then at the drive on the desk and the screen and the window behind Naomi's head showing the Chicago skyline, lit and indifferent, the city continuing its endless grinding machinery beneath them. He thought about 12 hours, about what 12 hours meant in a situation that had already been moving faster than their ability to contain it. About Julian Hawthorne, somewhere in this city, with 30% of the architecture of Naomi's exposure in a file on a drive, calling the people he intended to use it with, setting in motion the next sequence of a plan that had been running for longer than either of them had understood. He thought about what it would cost to keep Hawthorne in Chicago. He looked at Naomi. "I can do that," he said. She nodded once. She turned back to the screen. Her hands came off the desk and her fingers found the keyboard, and she began to move with the particular focused velocity of a person who has decided completely and without remainder that the situation in front of them is the only situation that matters, and that they will not be the thing that fails. Dominic moved toward the door. Dominic. He turned. She was still looking at the screen. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and without performance. Just the plain sound of a person saying a true thing in the middle of a night that had done its best to make truth unaffordable. "Thank you," she said, "for downstairs, for stepping in front of—" She stopped. Her jaw moved. "I know what it cost." He stood in the doorway with the Chicago night behind him and looked at the back of her head and the set of her shoulders and the crimson gown and all of the things she had built and protected and sacrificed and refused to apologize for over 6 years. "It didn't cost enough," he said. "Not yet." He walked out into the hall, and Carver fell into step beside him, and somewhere in the city below, Julian Hawthorne was moving with what he believed was the weapon that would end this. And he had 11 hours and 53 minutes before Naomi Brooks finished what she had started, and every second between now and then was going to be the most expensive second either of them had ever spent. The elevator doors opened. Dominic stepped in, and the war that had started with a red dress and a stolen thread of $4 million and a ballroom full of dangerous men finally revealed what it had always been. Not a conflict between two criminal empires, but a single calculated move against the one person in Chicago that Julian Hawthorne had correctly identified as the most dangerous mind in the room. He just hadn't planned for what happened when that mind decided to fight back. The city did not sleep. Chicago never really slept. It just changed registers, shifted from the daytime frequency of commerce and ambition into the nighttime frequency of something older and less polished, the hum of machinery that ran beneath the surface of the civilized version. Trucks moved through empty intersections. The lake made its cold, indifferent sounds against the breakwater. And on the 43rd floor of the Vescary Tower, in an office that smelled like overheated electronics and the remnants of a very long day, Naomi Brooks did not sleep either. She worked. The first 2 hours were the kind of work that looked, from the outside, like a person simply sitting at a desk staring at screens. Marcus, who had arrived at 11:15 with a change of clothes she hadn't asked for and a container of coffee she would not have survived without, stood near the door for 20 minutes before understanding that there was nothing useful he could do and quietly left. Carver came in twice with updates she absorbed without looking away from the monitors. Dominic did not come in at all, which was the right decision, and she knew it was the right decision. And she was grateful for it and hated that she was grateful in equal measure. She had built the financial architecture of this organization brick by brick over 6 years. She knew every corridor of it, every load-bearing wall, every place where the structure was solid, and every place where it was held together by something more provisional than it appeared. She knew it the way you know a building you designed yourself. Not just the blueprints, but the smell of it, the sound it made when the pressure changed, the specific ways it would fail if it failed. Julian Hawthorne knew 30% of it. The oldest 30%, the part she had built first, before she'd understood all the lessons she would eventually learn about the difference between legal and defensible. Before she'd made the adjustments that had made the later architecture cleaner and harder to misrepresent. 30% was enough to damage her. It was not enough to destroy the organization, but damage to her was the point, and she had to work with that understanding, which meant the question wasn't how to protect the organization from what Hawthorne had. The question was how to make what Hawthorne had irrelevant before he used it. There were two ways to make leverage irrelevant. You could take it away from the person holding it, or you could make their credibility so thoroughly demolished that anything they presented, regardless of its content, would be evaluated through the lens of their own exposure. Naomi had chosen the second path 40 minutes into the first hour, because the first path required physical access to wherever Hawthorne had sent the copy, and physical access was a variable she couldn't control from a keyboard. The second path was the one she had spent her entire career building the capacity to execute. It required the financial intelligence she had been accumulating since before Hawthorne set foot in Chicago. It required the Malta account information, the Provence property, the cartel discrepancy she had identified at the gala. And it required one more thing, the identity of the person Hawthorne had transferred the copied files to, because that person was not Hawthorne himself, and finding them was the thread that would unravel everything. She found the transfer recipient at 12:47 in the morning. She sat with the name for a moment, the way she sat with information that landed harder than expected. Then she opened a new window and started building. Dominic spent the first 3 hours of the night doing what he did when the situation required presence rather than action. He moved through the building, down to the lobby, back up to the 32nd floor where he had a secondary office he used when he needed to be in the building without being on the primary floor, and back up again. He made calls. 6 of them, to 6 different people in 6 different parts of Chicago's operational infrastructure, and what he said to each of them was calibrated to produce a specific outcome. Julian Hawthorne would find, progressively, over the next 12 hours, that the city he had come to absorb was developing a texture of resistance that no amount of money or mercenary deployment could smooth over. The warehouse fires started at 11, not Dominic's warehouses. That had been Hawthorne's opening move, and the fires were already out, the damage assessed, the insurance claims already mentally filed in the category of recoverable losses. These were pressure fires, the kind that communicated the specific message that operating within a city's infrastructure required the goodwill of the people who ran that infrastructure, and that goodwill was a thing that could be withdrawn. The Port Authority contacts that Morrow had given Hawthorne, the names of the city council members on Dominic's payroll, proved less useful than Hawthorne had anticipated, because what Morrow hadn't known, and what Naomi had architected specifically so that Morrow couldn't know, was that those relationships had been restructured 8 months earlier. The council members Hawthorne approached in the hours after the gala found that their current arrangements were more complex than the intelligence he presented, and their responses were accordingly unhelpful. The mercenaries who had been positioned at the hotel's back entrance were picked up by midnight. Because Dominic had 3 relationships with Chicago law enforcement that operated quietly and without documentation, and deploying armed men at the service entrance of a hotel in the Gold Coast was not an activity that required prosecutorial enthusiasm to become problematic. The arrest of 6 men with European passports and unlicensed weapons in an alley off East Walton Street did not make the morning news. It didn't need to. By 2 in the morning, Julian Hawthorne's operational footprint in Chicago had been compressed from aggressive to defensive, and the man himself had relocated from wherever he'd been immediately after the gala to the Peninsula Hotel on Superior Street, which was either a decision driven by comfort or by the specific logic of a man who needed to be somewhere with good security and multiple exits. And in either case, it told Dominic something useful about his state of mind. At 2:17, his phone buzzed with a text from Naomi. It said, "I have him. Come up." She had moved to the secondary screen by the time he came through the door, and she had a legal pad covered in both sides of handwriting that she slid across the desk to him without preamble, the way she always delivered information that needed to speak before she did. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "The cartel," he said. "The Cali Consortium." "Yes." She leaned back in the chair and picked up the coffee container, found it empty, set it down. "The person Hawthorne transferred the files to tonight is a man named Reyes. He's the consortium's North American financial liaison. He manages the interface between the cartel's international operations and its legitimate investment vehicles in the U.S. Hawthorne has been using him as a conduit for the last 3 years. The arrangement works as long as Hawthorne produces returns and maintains operational security." She looked at the legal pad. "The Malta account that I identified at the gala, the $2.8 million that the consortium is looking for, I've now traced the complete movement of that money. It wasn't just redirected to Hawthorne's personal property. Half of it went further, to accounts controlled by Reyes personally." Dominic was very still. "Reyes has been stealing from the consortium," he said, "and he's been using Hawthorne as cover. As long as Hawthorne is the one the consortium is looking at, Reyes stays invisible." "Yes. And the files Hawthorne copied from your drive tonight, the documentation about my financial restructuring work, he was planning to present them to the consortium as evidence that Reyes had been working with an outside financial operator to move their money without authorization. He was going to use your contingency files to manufacture a frame for Reyes, position himself as the person who uncovered the theft, and eliminate his conduit before Reyes could eliminate him. She paused. They were both planning to betray each other. They had just arrived at different timelines. The room was quiet for a moment with the weight of that particular human mathematics. Two men, each planning to destroy the other, each believing he was the one who would move first. "How complete is your documentation?" Dominic said. "Complete enough." She met his eyes. "The consortium's North American contact for external intelligence is a man I've had an indirect relationship with for 4 years through the Harmon portfolio work. He has his own reasons for wanting clarity on the Malta discrepancy. If I present what I have, the full trail, the Reyes connection, the Hawthorne frame attempt, tonight, before Hawthorne can present his version, you go to the consortium. I send the documentation, anonymously and through channels that can't be traced back to this organization." She looked at the legal pad. Hawthorne loses his cartel funding before sunrise. Without the consortium behind him, the mercenaries don't get paid, the Port Authority play collapses, and the copied files become irrelevant because the person holding them no longer has the credibility or the resources to deploy them. She paused. "And the consortium's response to learning what Reyes has done to them will be significantly more comprehensive than anything we could arrange." Dominic looked at the window. The city was out there, its lights unchanged, patient in the way that cities are patient, absorbing everything, reflecting nothing, continuing regardless. He thought about the cartel, about the specific category of response that the discovery of internal theft by a trusted financial liaison would produce in an organization that operated without courts or due process or any of the civilized mechanisms that slowed the consequences of betrayal. He thought about Reyes, about Hawthorne. He thought about what Naomi was proposing, which was not violence and not force, and not the kind of direct confrontation that left physical evidence and legal exposure. It was the deployment of truth, strategically timed and precisely targeted, which was both more elegant and more devastating than anything he could have ordered Carver to do. "The consortium finds out what Reyes did," he said. "Hawthorne loses his protection and his resources, and the files from your drive lose their usefulness because the man who has them is now running for his life." "Yes." "And your exposure in those files. If Hawthorne is scrambling to survive, he's not presenting evidence to anyone. And if Reyes is—" She stopped, selected the word carefully. "No longer in a position to receive information, the transfer is effectively orphaned. It exists on a drive somewhere, but the chain of custody and intention behind it dissolves." She looked at him steadily. "It's not a perfect outcome. The documentation exists. That's a permanent condition that I have to live with. But contained, without active deployment, it's a vulnerability I can manage. The same way I've managed every other vulnerability in this organization for 6 years. He looked at her, at the legal pad with its 2 sides of handwriting, and the monitors with their accumulated evidence, and the coffee container she'd set down when it ran out, and the crimson gown which she was still wearing at 2 in the morning, because there had not been a single moment in the last 6 hours where stopping to change had been a thing that was possible. At the woman who had walked into a room full of criminals in a dress that wasn't hers, and disarmed a man with a single conversation, and triggered a server lockdown, and identified a double betrayal, and built a counter-strategy in the same hours that most people would have spent processing shock. He thought about what Morrow had said in the alcove near the coat check. "She's extraordinary," said with the particular bitterness of a man who had understood what he was undermining and had done it anyway. He thought about the 9 years he had watched Elias Morrow and trusted him, and the 6 years he had watched Naomi Brooks and not trusted her, exactly. Something more than trusted. Something he didn't have a clean professional word for, which was why he'd never said it, and why it had accumulated over 6 years into something that took up considerably more space than any clean professional word could contain. "Send it," he said. She nodded once. She turned to the keyboard. She worked for another 22 minutes, and he sat in the chair across from her desk and watched the city through the window and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. And sometimes the most honest thing you could do was simply be present in a room while someone who was better at a specific thing than you were finished doing it. At 3:09 in the morning, she sat back. "It's sent," she said. The response, when it came, did not announce itself dramatically. That was not how these things worked. The consortium did not send notifications or issue statements. What happened instead was a series of small things spread across the hours before dawn that told the story for anyone who knew how to read it. At 4:15, the mercenaries who had been providing external security for Hawthorne's Chicago operation began leaving. Not all at once. In ones and twos, the way men leave when they've received the specific kind of communication that renders continued presence both unprofitable and dangerous. By 5 o'clock, 6 of the 8 positions Carver had been monitoring were vacant. At 4:40, a financial account associated with a shell company in the Cayman Islands, the account that had been funding Hawthorne's operational costs in Chicago, went inactive. Naomi watched it happen on her screen and said nothing, just made a small notation on the legal pad. At 5:20, Dominic received a call from one of his Port Authority contacts, a man who had been positioned earlier in the evening to resist Hawthorne's approaches. The contact reported that 2 of Hawthorne's representatives had attempted to finalize a meeting about the lakefront zoning play and had, in the last hour, abruptly withdrawn the request without explanation. The contact sounded confused. Dominic thanked him and ended the call. At 6:03, as the first gray suggestion of dawn began to differentiate the lake from the sky, Carver texted, "Peninsula Hotel." Hawthorne checked out. Single car, airport direction. Dominic read the text and showed it to Naomi without comment. She read it, set the phone back on the desk, looked at the window for a moment where the city was beginning its slow morning reassembly. The earliest light, the shift change of the city's nocturnal machinery, the sky going from black to the specific dark blue that precedes color. "Reyes?" Dominic said. "By the time Hawthorne lands wherever he's going," she said, "the consortium will have had 3 hours with the documentation I sent. The response timeline for something at that level is—" She stopped, looked at the legal pad. "He won't be Hawthorne's problem to worry about." The sentence sat in the room with all its implications, and neither of them examined those implications aloud, because some things were true and necessary and still too heavy to hold in direct language. Morrow was in a room on the building's 20th floor, where he had been since Dominic had made 3 calls at 11:30. The room had a lock on the outside and 2 men in the hallway, and the specific quality of a space that a person had entered without fully understanding the permanence of the arrangement. Dominic would deal with Morrow before the morning was over, and the dealing would be final and it would not be clean. And he was not going to think about it yet because there were things still more immediately requiring his attention. He looked at Naomi. She was looking at the legal pad with the expression of someone who has come through the far end of something very large and is sitting in the aftermath, taking stock, not yet sure what is still standing. "The 30%, he said. "What's your exposure?" "Honestly." She was quiet for a moment. In the 6 years he had known her, she had never been dishonest with him about a risk assessment. Not once. Even when the honest assessment was one that reflected badly on her own work. It was one of the things he had counted on from the beginning, the one quality in a world of strategic presentation that had never been strategic. If the drive is ever recovered and the content is ever presented with the right framing to the right audience, she said, it would take approximately 18 months of legal response to fully contextualize and defend the 2019 restructuring work. During those 18 months, I would be operationally compromised. The organization would need to function without my direct financial oversight. She looked at him. "It's manageable. It's not comfortable, and it's not what I would choose, but it's manageable." "And if the drive is never recovered, then it's a permanent background variable in a risk profile that I will monitor and account for." She met his eyes. "I've been managing permanent background variables since I was 9 years old. I know how to carry them." He believed her. He had always believed her when she said things like this. Not because she was invulnerable. She was not, and she had never pretended to be. But because the carrying was something she had been doing her whole life, and she had gotten very, very good at it. The weight had shaped her. The way weight shapes everything, it doesn't break. "Morrow's information," he said. "The council members, the port schedule, the security protocols, the damage from that. Repairable. The council relationships need to be reevaluated and restructured, which I was planning to do in the second quarter anyway. The port schedule changes as a matter of routine, which means anything he gave Hawthorne is already partially stale. The security protocols." She glanced at Carver, who was standing near the door with his repaired cheek and his steady eyes. Those need a complete rebuild, starting with the personnel who had access to them. Starting today. Starting this morning, she said, after I sleep for 4 hours. He almost smiled. The almost was visible enough that she saw it, and something moved in her expression in response. Not quite a smile, not quite relief. Something in the territory between them that had been building for 6 years and had never quite found the room to resolve itself into a name. The gala, she said. The exposure downstairs. What you said in front of the syndicate leaders. I know. They saw it, all of them. She looked at her hands on the desk, then back at him. The political calculus of that is, there will be people who try to use it, who see it as a vulnerability. Let them try. Dominic, I said it in that room because it was true, he said. Not because it was strategic, not because I calculated the outcome, because it was true, and I was done calculating around it. And if the cost of saying true things is that people understand where I can be reached, then that's the cost. He paused. I've been managing the cost of hiding it for 6 years. The other cost can't be worse. She looked at him for a long moment. The dawn light was coming properly now, the sky east of the lake going from dark blue to the specific pale gray that precedes the sun. The city was assembling itself. Traffic beginning. The machinery of the ordinary world starting up its diurnal engines, indifferent to what the night had contained. You should know, she said carefully, that I am not someone who becomes less complicated over time. I know that. I have a permanent background variable in my risk profile and a drive somewhere in the world with documentation that could be weaponized, and I work for a criminal organization that I am under no illusions about, and I am very particular about how I spend my trust because I have spent it badly before and I remember exactly what that felt like. I know all of that. And you're still, yes, he said, simply and without decoration. Yes. She looked at him. Then she looked at the window and the dawn and the city below, the one she had grown up in and fought to survive in and built her competence in and walked through with the specific armor of a woman who had been judged by strangers before they knew her name, in rooms where she had to be twice as certain to be believed half as readily, in organizations and institutions that had looked at her and seen something other than what was actually there. She reached across the desk and picked up the legal pad, held it for a moment, then set it down. 4 hours, she said. 4 hours, he agreed. Elias Morrow left Chicago on a Tuesday morning in early December, under arrangements that were not publicized and in circumstances that precluded public comment. The specific terms of his departure were between him and Dominic, and involved the liquidation of certain assets and the permanent relinquishment of certain operational knowledge and the understanding, conveyed clearly and without ambiguity, that there were people in the world whose goodwill was the only thing standing between his current condition and a considerably less comfortable one. He did not argue. He had lost the standing to argue, and he knew it. And in the end, what remained of the man Dominic had known for 9 years was something depleted and pragmatic and very tired, and he signed what was put in front of him and left. And the door he went through was one he would not be returning through. The Port Authority contracts were restructured over the following 6 weeks, with a new legal architecture that Naomi designed from the ground up, incorporating the lessons of what had been exposed and the corrections she had been planning anyway. The council relationships were reevaluated with the specific, unsentimental clarity of a woman who had been managing political exposure for long enough to know exactly what each relationship was worth and exactly what it was costing. 2 were terminated. 3 were renegotiated. 1 was discovered to have an additional connection to a competing interest that Naomi filed under the category of useful information for future reference. The security protocols were rebuilt entirely, with Carver running the operational rebuild and Naomi designing the financial monitoring component that would flag anomalous patterns of the kind that Morrow had exploited. The rebuild took 11 days and cost a significant amount of money and was worth considerably more than it cost. The drive with the copied files was never recovered. Its location remained a permanent background variable in a risk profile that was monitored quarterly and never activated. Julian Hawthorne was last documented in a city in Southeast Asia, operating in a reduced capacity under a different arrangement with interests that had no Chicago footprint. The cartel's response to the Reyes situation produced no public record. Some things end without announcement, in the specific silence of consequences that are complete before anyone outside the relevant parties is aware they have occurred. The organization restructured itself over the following months with a quietness that those who watched Chicago's underground noted and discussed and could not quite categorize. The visible face of Vescari operations remained what it had always been: real estate, development, the legitimate surfaces of a business empire that had long since learned to look unremarkable. But beneath that surface, the architecture had changed. The financial network was cleaner, more resilient, built on a foundation that was harder to compromise and faster to defend. The political relationships were fewer and more reliable. The personnel structure had been reduced in size and increased in quality. Nobody outside the organization fully understood the change. They noted the outcome: stability, continued operation, the absence of the disruption that Hawthorne's arrival had seemed to promise, without being able to account for it. The whispers that circulated through the underworld were imprecise, as whispers tend to be, because the people who knew the precise version were not the kind of people who contributed to whispers. What circulated was the shape of the story without its content: that someone had come to Chicago to take everything and had left with nothing, and the reason had something to do with a woman, and the rest was unclear. That was fine. Naomi had spent her career in the space of what was unclear to other people. It was a Thursday in late January when Marcus found her standing at the window of her office, which was unusual because Naomi Brooks was not someone who stood at windows. She worked. She analyzed. She moved with the specific directionality of a person who had always had more to do than time to do it in, and looking at views was the kind of contemplative pause that had never fit her operational tempo. But she was standing at the window with the lake visible in the middle distance, frozen now, at the edges in the way it froze in deep winter, and the city spread out below in the particular clarity of a cold January morning when the air had been scrubbed clean by the overnight temperature and everything looked slightly more real than usual. She was not wearing a navy suit. She had stopped wearing the navy suits in December, not dramatically, not as a statement, but in the quiet way of a person who has stopped needing a particular piece of armor because the threat it was designed for has changed shape. What she wore now was still professional, still precise, still communicating exactly what she wanted to communicate before she opened her mouth. But it communicated something additional that the navy suits had been designed to suppress, that the person wearing it had decided, somewhere in the accounting that followed a very long night in November, that taking up space was not a concession she needed to negotiate for. Marcus put a file on her desk and said nothing and left, because he had worked for her long enough to recognize the difference between a pause that wanted interruption and one that didn't. She stood at the window for another few minutes. The lake, the city, the frozen edges of a thing that would thaw eventually, as it always did, as everything did, given enough time and enough change in the surrounding conditions. She thought about the 9-year-old girl on the South Side stoop in the too small coat. She thought about the room she had walked into over the course of her career, the weight of being assessed before being known, the years of building competence as the only currency that was never subject to the opinions of people who didn't want to extend credit. She thought about a red dress that wasn't hers, and a ballroom full of dangerous men, and the specific moment when she had stepped around Dominic Vescari rather than behind him and felt the difference between the two as something physical. She thought about what it had cost. All of it, the whole accounting, the exposure, the sleepless night, the knowledge of what was on a drive somewhere in the world, the understanding that the work of protecting herself would never be fully done, would always require monitoring and adjustment and the specific vigilance of a person who knew exactly how much the world was capable of. She thought about what it was worth. The door opened behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew the sound of that particular door and that particular footfall, which was the footfall of a man who moved like someone who had never been surprised by anything and had learned to walk that way so convincingly that it had become true. "The Harmon Quarterly," Dominic said. "On your desk." "I saw it." A pause. "It's thorough." "It's always thorough." He came to stand beside her at the window. Not close, not the careful professional distance of the years before November, but the distance of two people who have stopped performing the distance and arrived at something more honest. The lake was visible from here, and the sky above it, and the city between them and the water, all of it lit in the cold January clarity. "Chicago," he said. Chicago, she agreed. The city held them the way it held everything, without sentiment, without apology, with the complete indifference of a place that had seen every version of this story and would outlast this version and every version after it. It did not care about them. It did not need to. That was what made it theirs, in the particular way that things belong to the people who have earned them, not through inheritance or convenience, but through the specific hard work of staying. She had stayed. She was still here, in a coat that fit, in an office 43 floors above the city that had tried to make her small, standing next to the one person in the room who had known what she was worth before she said a word, and who had spent 6 years being careful about it, and who had stopped being careful on a night in November when careful became insufficient. Neither of them said anything for a while. The city moved below them. The lake held its cold. The January light did what January light does, cut clean and honest through the air, illuminating everything it touched without warmth, without mercy, with the simple impartial clarity of something that is decided to show the world exactly as it is. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. End.